Hi, thanks for joining us this evening. I'd like to welcome everyone to our first Centre for the Study of International Slavery and Liverpool University Press book club. So just before we start, sorry for a bit of a dry throat. I'm Dr. Laura Sandy. I'm the co-director of the Centre for the Study of International Slavery, so I'll be hosting the event this evening. I'll be introducing you to our speaker shortly, but I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping first. So just to make everyone aware that this Zoom webinar is being recorded. And so when you're listening and you're using the chat function, you're asking questions, please just be respectful towards each other. Of course, any questions you've got, burning questions for John Oldfield, who will be our speaker, please put them in the Q&A function, and I'll ask them to John at the end of his presentation. So if you want to use the chat function for other comments, that's great too. I'm just going to have a sip of water. And I'd also like to thank Sherilyn Haggerty and Mary Booth and Catherine Pugh for putting this together. Catherine's from the Liverpool University Press. So thanks so much for organising this for this evening or this afternoon, depending on where you are tuning in from. So the book club is really something that we decided we'd do, or we try to give people the opportunity to meet and hear about and discuss the work of authors who publish with the Liverpool University Press in their series studies in the international studies in international slavery. And so the press itself is instrumental in this, and we would love it if you want to research the series or if you want to look into it. You can go onto the Liverpool University Press website, and if you'd like to hear more about books in the series, brilliant books like John's that he's about to tell us about, do go and look. And if you're interested in perhaps publishing with the series, thinking about the work that you're doing, and this is an interdisciplinary series, then do contact our commissioning editor, Ali Lee, and his details are on the website. So with that business aside, let's get to the main part, the more interesting stuff. So I would like to welcome, and sort of I like to do an applause, even though we're on a Zoom room, John Oldfield, as our very first book club presenter, and we're really proud to host John this evening. He's actually in Toronto at the moment. I'm also on the north coast of America, so we're zooming in from different time zones. So John Oldfield has had a long and very successful career. He's an emeritus professor of slavery and emancipation at the University of Hull. He specialises in the history of slavery and abolition in the Atlantic world. And between 2013 and 2020, he was the director of the Wilberforce Institute for the Study of Slavery at the University of Hull. John's published a lot of books, so I'm going to read out briefly some of the highlights. I'm sure you could go onto John's website and see all the amazing things he's done, but I'll give you an overview, and I'm going to hand over to John to tell you about the book that he's published with Liverpool University Press. So Popular Politics and British Anti-Slavery in 1995, Chords of Freedom, Commemoration Ritual and British Anti-Slavery in 2007, a great book which I really enjoyed, John. Transatlantic Abolitionism in the Age of Revolution, 2013. And even last month, Decolonising Colonial Heritage, a collection John co-edited, so October 2021, hot off the press. But tonight, John's going to be speaking about his book, as I said, in our series at the University of Liverpool with the Liverpool University Press. And this book is entitled The Ties That Bind, Transatlantic Abolitionism in the Age of Reform, 1820 to 1865. And rather than give you an overview, I'm going to hand you to the expert. I'm going to hand over to John to tell us all about his work. So over to you, John.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Laura, for that very generous introduction. And thank you to the organisers for inviting me for this, the launch of this very interesting series, this book club. Now, I'll try and keep this as brief as I can. Obviously, this is maybe a thin book, but it covers a lot of territory. Those of you who are familiar with my work will know that I've been for a long time interested in two things. One of them is opinion building, which as a kind of shorthand definition, what I mean by that is the means whereby activists created a constituency for anti-slavery. And the other idea is transatlanticism. Now, I'm not claiming that that's a particularly new idea. Some of you will be familiar with the pioneering work done during the 1970s by people like Betty Flaidland and Claire Taylor that really opened our eyes to these kind of transatlantic connections. And there's been a huge amount of work produced since. But I do think that this is an emphasis that needs drawing attention to, not least because of the current fascination, I think, in some quarters with nationalist narratives around anti-slavery or forms of exceptionalism. And I'm thinking of Andrew Delbanco's quite controversial book in 2012, where he talked about American immediatism as a peculiarly American impulse that linked anti-slavery in the 19th century with the civil rights movement, women's rights, gay rights in the 20th century, and so forth. And that I think touched on this notion in his case of American exceptionalism. And I think there's also some tendencies which were evident in 2007, whereby the British experience is sort of wrapped up into a kind of unique British tradition of humanitarian interventionism. So my interest in transatlanticism is a kind of corrective, I suppose. And my starting point is this idea that anti-slavery abolition, call it what you will, was never a peculiarly British idea any more than it was a peculiarly American idea. Instead, it was an international movement, not without its tensions and differences, to be sure, but nonetheless remarkably durable. And it's this idea of transatlanticism, these kind of interesting connections that are really were the starting point, or are the starting point for the book we're talking about this evening, The Ties That Bind, which is, I guess, borrowed from Bruce Springsteen, a meditation, if you will, on Anglo-American cooperation during what I call the Age of Reform, sort of roughly between 1820 and 1865. Now, at this point, I wanted to start with or at least draw your attention to an image which I use in the book, which is this one. If you can all see that. Can you all see that? Now, this is from a very popular book published in 1897, The Library of Universal History, which was published in New York. It's one of these kind of exploring multi-volume affairs. And this is from volume 13, and it's a chapter on 19th century America. And these 6 pen portraits are used here to illustrate, quote, the abolition movement. And some of these figures will be familiar to you: John Brown, Harriet Beecher Stowe, of course, William Lloyd Garrison, who is should be recognized, I think, as the founder of second wave abolitionism from the 1830s onwards, Charles Sumner, Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, and perhaps more surprisingly, William Wilberforce. And you might ask yourself, what is he doing there? This figure who seems, in the bottom right-hand corner, who seems to anchor the whole set of portraits, providing the whole movement with a ready-made history. Now, this is fascinating to me, but it's not unexpected. Wilberforce was a familiar figure, certainly in America during the 18th century, the early abolitionist movement, as were figures like Granville Sharp and Thomas Clarkson. But what's interesting, I think, for me, is the way in which Garrison in particular capitalizes on the kind of British success as he saw it. Interestingly, Garrison was in Britain in 1833, and he attended Wilberforce's funeral, which took place shortly after the Emancipation Act was passed by the British Parliament. And it seems to me that, and he makes no bones about this, Garrison uses that moment, I think, to create a kind of continuous link between the British past and the American present. And one of the ways he does that when he gets back to the United States is through the American Anti-Slavery Society. They elevate the 1st of August, the date of emancipation in the Caribbean, to a central place in the American abolitionist calendar. And in The Ties That Bind, I talk a little bit about this process, the way in which the 1st of August, throughout many New England towns and into New York and beyond, will hold an annual 1st of August celebration, which consisted of parades, marches, picnics, lectures, at which people would not only celebrate the 1st of August and the British past, but also use that as a way of rousing the followers to move forward in terms of American abolitionism. And what's also interesting is that that process cuts across racial lines. So there are also, from the 1830s, Black 1st of August celebrations, which again took to the streets, again quite mannered in the way in which they appropriate the names of people like Wilberforce, in order to create what I think is a form of, in some cases, quite a radical form of community activism. And it's worth stressing, before I go on any further, that this is quite risky business in a country where pro-slavery interests are strong. Abolitionism is seen as, for them, as a kind of un-American or anti-American activity. And those who supported abolition were often the targets of anti-abolitionist mobs. So, and Blacks were particularly vulnerable. Riots in Philadelphia in 1834 and 1842, where Blacks were targeted, supposedly because of their allegiance to notions of abolitionism. So, identifying yourself with the cause of Britain could be a risky business. The point is, though, that these ideas, these kind of looking back to the British past, do become quite an important phenomenon. And a lot now has been written on this idea of Black Anglophilia in particular. And Frederick Douglass is a very good example of that. Douglass spends a lot of time repeatedly talking about the universal significance of the 1st of August, 1834, and the way in which, as well, he argues that what Garrison actually did, and this was by means of a kind of backhanded compliment, what Garrison did was simply applied a British abolitionism to American slavery. So why I'm emphasizing this is I think these forms of Anglophilia underpinned a huge amount of abolitionist Anglo-American activity during the mid-19th century. And in the process, what activists create is an anti-slavery community through which they transmit ideas, personnel, and there are lots of, it's sometimes difficult to know where ideas come from. But what interests me in this book is some of the continuities that we can see through this transatlantic community. So we can look at politics, and you can see the ways in which people handle politics, particularly around the pledging of parliamentary candidates. This is done on both sides of the Atlantic. The idea of privately or publicly sounding a candidate out before you give him your vote. This is one of those interesting continuities. So too is the use of paid anti-slavery lecturers. This is again an idea which we think had its origins in the UK in the early 1830s, when the agency committee employed a group of 5 lecturers to appeal directly to the British public. And this is seen as an important development, the movement from the written word to oratory and anti-slavery oratory. And a key figure in this is this man, George Thompson, who was one of those lecturers, quite an unconventional figure in many ways, but an electrifying speaker. Everybody agreed that they'd never seen anything quite like Thompson, who seemed to have this ability to draw audiences along with him. And this is, 19th century audiences were fascinated by this idea of eloquence, and the way in which the eloquent speaker was able to carry audiences along with them and play, literally play with their emotions. Thompson was seen as a sort of a kind of an expert at this kind of eloquent, electrifying speaking. What's interesting is that Thompson met Garrison in London in 1833 rather, which was the start of a lifetime friendship. And the outcome of this immediately was that Garrison invited Thompson to go to the United States and lecture, which he did in 1834-35. It was quite an eventful tour, which I'm happy to talk to people about. It ended up with Thompson having to leave because he was under threat for his life. But what's interesting, I think, about Thompson's visit was that it becomes a catalyst for change. After 1834, the agency system took off in the United States. It's just a remarkable story. Most American anti-slavery societies employed agents, some of them local agents, some of them traveling agents. And some of them, the big American anti-slavery society may have had sometimes 50 of these people on their books at any one time. The numbers could easily total over the period up to 1865, could have run into the very high hundreds, if not the thousands. So this becomes very much an important American phenomenon. It kind of galvanizes the American movement. Many of these lecturers are white, but increasingly the agency system becomes more diverse. The introduction of Black agents, Charles Lennox Raymond, Frederick Douglass was an anti-slavery agent. So too was William Wells Brown. And then there were also female agents. Abby Kelly, who went on to actually run the whole agency system on behalf of the American Anti-Slavery Society. And some people who went on to become very significant figures in the women's movement, Lucy Stone and Susan B. Anthony. These were both anti-slavery agents. And what fascinated me in terms of resonance about this agency system was that it has echoes, I think, of what goes on in the 1960s. These agents are rather like civil rights activists, frontline workers. Their job is to create an anti-slavery public and in the process sow the seeds of radical political change. And this is, again, quite risky business, but it's a vital part of the wider abolitionist effort in the United States right up until the eve of the American Civil War. But again, to me, and the way I present this in the book, there's a kind of an interesting British backstory which involves this figure, George Thompson. So I'm interested in these continuities which the book addresses, but I don't wish to imply from this that American abolitionism was some kind of simply a pale imitation of British anti-slavery. Quite the opposite. While American activists were certainly willing and sometimes eager to borrow ideas from the UK, they also created their own distinct abolitionist culture. And many of you will probably be familiar with aspects of that. I just wanted here to draw attention to these are the Hutchinson family singers. One of the things I got very interested in this book was anti-slavery music, or more specifically, anti-slavery songs, which were hugely popular in the United States, so much so that there were something like 13 collections of anti-slavery songs published between 1840 and 1856, some of them running into 100 individual songs. These were usually modern lyrics put to traditional music, but nonetheless, this is an incredibly vital and vibrant scene. And it's quite clear that abolitionists sang at meetings, singing about abolition, singing about slavery was an important part of the whole, what being an abolitionist meant, particularly if you went to public meetings, there would always be singing of some kind. Well, an interesting innovation is this group, the Hutchinson family, this idea of having paid anti-slavery singers. The Hutchinson family were a close harmony quartet from New Hampshire, and they again had an electrifying effect. They become, from the 1843 onwards, they become a regular feature on the anti-slavery circuit in the United States, and almost an attraction in themselves. And the way in which abolitionists use music is, I think, quite telling. The Hutchinsons would often turn up at meetings, they would open sessions, they would close sessions, but often they would sing at key moments, I think, quite strategically. You know, when a debate got quite heated, the Hutchinsons would be called upon to kind of diffuse the atmosphere or to accentuate a particular argument. So they are very much part of the whole business of doing anti-slavery, and some of the biggest meetings in the United States ran for 2 or 3 days, and the Hutchinsons were an important part of all of this. Now, in 1845, the Hutchinsons came to the UK, and they came over with Frederick Douglass and stayed almost 12 months. Now, what's interesting about this is that they met with a mixed success. They were quite popular in the northwest of England, but flopped in London. And they were shunned for the most part by British abolitionists. And the reasons are, I think, part of the novelty. People in Britain generally seem not to have sung at meetings. This was seen as a great novelty. Some people were clearly suspicious, and there were all kinds of prejudices, I suppose, about this kind of music. The Times described the Hutchinsons' songs as vulgar, which I think speaks volumes about elite preconceptions about American music, but about this group in particular. But what's interesting about that reception, I think, is that it anticipates a lot of British responses to what they see as the kind of increasing Americanization of a lot of abolitionist culture. So responses to Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, for instance, responses to Black American visitors to the UK in the 1840s and 50s, particularly those who seem to blur the distinction between entertainment and education, people like Henry Box Brown. All of this created forms, I think, a degree of anxiety among British activists who tended to be much more staid and conservative, at least certainly in the eyes of people like William Lloyd Garrison. So this is not new. Audrey Fish has written quite extensively about these kind of transatlantic tensions, but they amplify a point that I've been trying to make in this book, which is that, you know, there was nothing, anti-slavery was never a monolithic structure, certainly not a monolithic international structure. There were always tensions, there were always strains, and there were clear divisions, not least between Garrisonians, who remained fervently moral suasionists, and political abolitionists on the other hand, who wanted not only to exercise the right to vote, but to create their own political parties. And there were always these kinds of tensions within this. And the American Civil War, as some of you will know, if anything, increased those divisions and tensions. For reasons of its own, the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society chose to side with the Confederacy on the grounds of the right of self-determination, but this had a shattering effect, in Richard Blackett's words. It kind of shattered the internationalist principles, that stance that had sustained the movement for 30 years or more. So I'm not trying to romanticize this kind of sense of community. There were always divisions, yet even at that moment of crisis during the American Civil War, something remained of this idea of international cooperation. And by way of starting to draw this to a close, I wanted to return to the friendship between Garrison and Thompson, which is the final chapter in the book. Now, this is an incredibly close relationship these two men share. Thompson is blindly loyal, you might argue, to Garrison, and it's in some ways makes his life difficult if you kind of read some of the details. But in this crucial final phase of his life and their relationship, Thompson does a remarkable thing. He comes back from India, his health is broken, but in 1862, he sort of rouses himself for one last struggle, namely to stump the country on behalf of the Union cause. And this has been acknowledged, written about, but it's for me, in the context of their very close relationship, it's a startling moment. This is, as I say, he's not well, but between December 1862 and December 1863, he gives hundreds of lectures up and down the country on the Civil War, in places far-flung as Glasgow, Perth, Bristol, Bath, Manchester, Coventry, helping, in his own words, to silence those who had been so confident in their utterances on behalf of the American South. And if you're interested in this, I do explore that part of the phase of this relationship in some detail in the book. There's more. On the back of this, early in 1864, Thompson decides to go to the United States again. And this turns out to be a remarkably successful, it's almost a triumphal tour, the climax of which is the opportunity to speak in the House of Representatives before an audience which included Abraham Lincoln and members of his cabinet. In 1835, Thompson had been literally driven out of the country. Here in 1864, he was greeted as a hero, a man that in the eyes of many Americans had done a huge amount to rouse British public opinion in support of the American Civil War. And as a final sort of a footnote to this, and I begin the chapter with this, this is a remarkable story, I think, where in mid-April 1865, there's a small party sails across Charleston Harbor to Fort Sumter to effectively retake it and raise the American flag. And part of that, one of the people on that trip is, not surprisingly, William Lloyd Garrison, who'd been invited. But he chooses to take with him George Thompson, not Wendell Phillips or any of his American friends, but George Thompson. And there are, in the newspaper accounts, there's this very affecting moment where, you know, we're led this kind of picture of the two men linking arms, again, the kind of symbol of Anglo-American competition, cooperation, linking arms, stepping on shore at Fort Sumter to claim their victory. A gesture, I think, that not only speaks volumes about the nature of their personal relationship, but about the wider sense of community they shared and operated in. And it's these ties that bind, I think, that I'm most interested in this book. And I think historians, to some extent, have underestimated the influence of friendship, and particularly masculine bonds, but also bonds among women. I could talk about that if people are interested. the way in which these bonds really kind of underpin this whole transatlantic abolitionist movement. So by way of drawing this to an end, I wanted to return to this notion that the way in which abolitionists saw themselves. In the 18th century, Granville Sharp talks a lot about his role as a global citizen. Sharp was very emphatic about this. Abolition for him was a transatlantic universal movement, and he saw his role in this very much as a global citizen. And Garrison talked about himself in the same way. He's deeply attuned to what's going on in Britain and across Europe. He sees himself as a global citizen. And this, I think, emphasizes the point I'm trying to make, that cosmopolitanism is and was an important dynamic within transatlantic abolitionism. And it's evident in common political attitudes and assumptions that flow from east to west and west to east. Of course, there were stresses and strains and splits and recriminations. That was inevitable. But those disputes, and they are quite significant, those disputes, should not disguise, I think, the sense of common purpose, of commitment and solidarity that bound together reformers on both sides of the Atlantic between the 1820 or the 1830s at least and 1865. And if we imagine abolitionism in this way, I think we can see how people on different sides of the Atlantic drew comfort from each other. They drew strength from each other, making for a movement that I think transcended national narrow boundaries and narrow political boundaries. Hence the title of my book, The Ties That Bind, which in an age of increasing polarization emphasizes the importance of transatlantic cooperation, not least in affecting meaningful and lasting political change. And that's the kind of takeaway from this book, the way in which we can see how internationalism was a means, certainly in terms of abolitionism, was a way of and a means of affecting meaningful and lasting political change. So I think at that point, I should probably stop talking and allow you to ask questions. So thank you very much. Hello.
Oh, sorry, I was having trouble clicking back on there. So thank you very much, John. Very, very interesting stuff. I like the well, not the idea, the reality of the singing troupe and the picture that you put up. So has anyone from our audience got any questions? I'm just gonna, so Helen, hold on, I'm just gonna get this up. Oh, it's in the chat. So do post your questions in the Q&A section. But so Helen says, it's fascinating to hear about the role of music and singing in the abolitionist meetings. Did this have a religious dimension? I'm wondering if that would influence how transferable it was across the Atlantic and to which British communities.
Yeah, well, interesting question. It does have a religious complexion. Obviously, Garrisonians were fervently evangelical, but I don't think that's necessarily a barrier to success. And it's actually quite. I think many abolitionists in Britain had problems with the Hutchinson singers, but they did find an audience in the UK, and they found an audience among mechanics institutes or institutions in Britain, particularly in the northwest of England. And here they presented themselves as reformers. There's an interesting account of them, a performance they gave in Manchester, where they declared from the stage that they were teetotalers, they were anti-war, and they were anti-slaveries. And this was met with thunderous applause. So what you're getting here is a kind of a reform agenda, which may have been wrapped up in a kind of religiosity, for want of a better word. But the Hutchinsons didn't overtly sing religious songs. They sang a lot of traditional songs. They sang a lot of songs, some songs which they wrote themselves, new lyrics set to traditional melodies, some of them minstrel melodies. So I think religion is part of that. It is part of that equation. But I think at some level, what's going on is just a kind of a cultural resistance which sees singing as something which is not quite done. It's clear when they sing in Dublin after Douglas has spoken. This is seen as a novelty, and the people are just shocked. Nobody had seen people singing. So I think there are some interesting resistances to this, but and some of that breaks down over time. I think. I mean, Frederick Douglass occasionally sings on the platform after speaking, and that is seen as something authentic, which people respond to. So I don't want to over-egg the resistance. I think it was partly finding an audience, and I think part of this is, and organized anti-slavery isn't as strong in the UK. There aren't as many opportunities to sing, or there aren't as many meetings. Some of it's cultural, and there may be some sort of religious resistance, particularly among Quakers, who would have found this a little bit disturbing, to say the least, of any kind of performance or theatricality. Would have shocked Quakers, and of course in the UK there were sort of very significant Quaker enclaves who would have resisted this. So I hope that goes some way to answering that question. But I'm fascinated by this, and I think it may be more important than we imagine, the role of music in abolitionism, and the way in which singing could rouse. There's an interesting debate in the States in the mid-19th century around the effectiveness of poetry and music as against traditional political tracts, and which is more effective in rousing people. Anyway, I think I hope that answers the question.
Great. Yeah, thanks very much for the question. So this is what I was going to ask, but from Sherilyn, could John please tell us more about the female activists and networks? Does he think personal networks were more important than formal ones?
Yeah, well, I'm increasingly, the second question, and I guess one of the messages of the book is that personal networks and connections, friendships are really, in many instances, more important than formal ties, and these work across political loyalties. But the friendship between Garrison and Thompson is one element, I think, of broader personal networks that really are very strong. In terms of women, there is a lot of contact, and one of the things, there are various ways in which this is expressed, but one of them is patterns of consumption, which I talk about in the book, and the Boston Anti-Slavery Bazaar in particular, where British women regularly produce goods which are sent across the Atlantic for the Boston. And there's a whole dialogue which goes on around the type of goods that should be sent, the importance of this contribution, the way in which in Boston, the people who run the Boston Anti-Slavery Bazaar, the way in which they are very, very keen to involve British women in what they see as another kind of transatlantic movement. And so the exchange of consumer items, many of them made by women, sewing bags, pins, all kinds of cushions, all kinds of things, which which have abolitionist emblems, is one of the most important ways in which women contribute to this kind of these networks I'm talking about. They also write, and poetry is a very good example of this, as is a sort of contribution from women to journals in the United States. Again, published on the back of the Anti-Slavery Bazaar in Boston. So women, these connections, I think, are incredibly important in the way in which women move into these spaces, which are very, very important, I think are crucial to the success of the movement I'm describing. There's a question from Gad there, which I missed. It flitted across the screen.
Yeah, I'll get down to So Gad says, thanks for your very interesting presentation. Could you tell us a bit more about the individual members of the Hutchinson family? What do we know about their origins and anything further on their impact?
Well, their origins. Okay, so they come from Milford, New Hampshire. It's a big, I think there are sort of 14 children. In total, they all get involved in singing. But what's interesting is that one of them, I forget which, actually sets up a singing school. So they have a professional interest in music, and they see that teaching music can actually be a means of making money. So that, I think, distinguishes them from other families or groups who sang. The Hutchinsons always have a kind of public kind of outlook on their involvement, and they specialize, as I think I said, in these close harmony singing, which is very distinctive, and there's a lot written about the purity of their voices and the way in which they convey emotions as well as messages. And it's the three brothers and Abby Hutchinson who form the core of what becomes the Hutchinson family singers. They're spotted by abolitionists, and then they are invited to abolitionist meetings. So there's an interesting moment, I think, where their repertoire slightly changes as they become seen as abolitionist singers. But throughout their careers, they didn't just sing abolitionist songs. They gave concerts where they would run through traditional songs which had nothing to do with slavery, even though they might have had some kind of reform angle. They wrote some of their own songs, which were more, I think, overtly political, either about temperance or about war. And then they come to Britain, they return, they're active for a while, and then slowly, somehow, they get tripped up in the anti-slavery politics of the 1850s. The Garrisonians for a while ostracized them because one of the Hutchinsons supports Henry Clay and kind of embraces political abolitionism of a kind. And then they disintegrate. And the turning point is when Abby Hutchinson marries and gives up singing. And the brothers continue, but another one of them commits suicide. And by the 1850s, they no longer exist. So it's an interesting moment. But I guess the point I'd want to make to Gad and others is that while the Hutchinsons are interesting and important, behind them is this huge popular interest in singing and anti-slavery songs. And if you read these collections of songs that I was talking about, in the introduction, it's quite clear that people expected these songs to be sung in the home, not just in public. So, the family was the idea was that the family would sing songs, and that song could be uplifting, and it could prompt people to deliberate action. So singing, it was a bit like poetry. It kind of elevated the mind, and it's about sort of these moral songs that they sang could be as important. And this is often said. It's an interesting piece in The Liberator where somebody says, you know, a well-chosen anti-slavery song could be worth much more than any anti-slavery lecture. You know, the effectiveness of music and poetry and the connection between the two is of prime importance. So does that, I hope that suffices, Gad. There's more in the book.
Yeah, everyone buy the book. There's a discount if you attended the talk. So yeah. I'd love to hear more details. I mean, it's interesting to imagine whether people were, you know, around their fire singing these songs in their homes, you know, in
well, there's
their wider families.
Yeah, there's a student at Columbia who contacted me about, she's found some scores I think, and she thinks there was more music making in the British home around anti-slavery ideas. So it may not be so exclusively an American phenomenon, the way in which you use music to address these things, but you might do it in private in the UK rather than in public. And what intrigues me about the UK case is how public this is and how singing and music shapes meetings. It's used in meetings to create moods and moods rather. And it's kind of reminiscent, I think, of the way in which music plays in the civil rights movement. And one of the things that I was kind of continuities I was trying to create in this book is that the way in which this movement anticipates a lot of the civil rights movement in terms of, you know, the use of agents, paid lecturers, frontline workers, the use of music and song. You know, if you think of Martin Luther King, you know, his I Have a Dream speech, there's a lot of music going on around that before and after it. Lots of people performing, creating moods. You know, these continuities are, I think, quite important. Sorry, I've gone to. I got quite enthused about music during writing this book, and I'm aware that not everyone shares that interest, perhaps.
No, I mean, you're enthusing me to read it. So I think it's obviously, you know, and again, it's interesting, the idea of performers. And I mean, I could go down another route, but there is a question. So I'm going to ask you the question before I take further down the rabbit hole. Yeah. Was Anglophilia shown by Black authors genuine, or was it part of getting the text read / heard by white abolitionists?
That's a good question, and I don't know whether we'll ever know. I mean, one of the things that struck me when writing this book, and I was looking at this phenomenon, I began with texts, but then I found other things. So some of the parades I was talking about, were the black parades or black celebrations. They would have a, you know, there would be a band of music, but it would be called the Wilberforce Band of Music. A lot of, when Wilberforce died, there were a lot of funeral orations by black, fairly prominent members of the black community who sort of hailed Wilberforce in particular as a figure who, again, had a universal significance. He wasn't that he was just an important British figure or English figure. He meant something to African Americans, and that African Americans should respect him and honor his memory. It's quite interesting how this plays. But and you know, Thomas Clarkson too, to a lesser extent. You know, there are some funeral orations when he dies in 1846 by Black Americans. So there is a kind of, I think there is an undertow here of respect and wanting to appropriate figures like Wilberforce, Clarkson, less Granville Sharp. But of course, there is always a thin line in doing this in terms of, you know, what are they trying to do, and what are they, you know, I mean, I think you can see how appropriating this is a way of stressing their independence and their resistance to sort of pro-slavery forces in the United States. But it's dangerous to do that, and they run risks. So I think we have to give some credence to the fact that some of this is genuine. And people like Alexander Cromwell, for instance, throughout his life, revered the British. Britain for him was always the ideal British, ideal state. He would never have anyone criticize Britain, not least because they'd given him an education. But that's a different matter. But it's an interesting what's going on in terms of black Anglophilia is perhaps more complicated than at first appears. So, I would agree with you to some extent, Laura.
Has anyone got any more questions? You can voice them. Don't have to type them, or you can type them. I have a little question, and it may just be. I love to ask a question where the answer is either no or unanswerable. So I was interested when you. Although we're talking about the ties that bind and sort of Anglo-American cooperation and Garrison taking Thompson, there was that snippet there of, slight snootiness or competition with the Times quote about, this is vulgar. And so I just wondered if there was any sense in the US, in the press, or, just in any stuff that you've looked at, where there was a bit more of a kind of not quite competitive edge, but maybe a critique, a similar critique going the other way across the Atlantic. So, are these UK or British abolitionists rather not progressive enough with their tactics? Are they not dynamic enough? We're doing this new stuff. Are they too elitist?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Laura. And in fact, Garrison, for all his kind of wanting to identify himself with Britain, becomes very critical of British reformers, as he refers to them. And this comes to a head over at the 1840 convention, the General Anti-Slavery Convention, where, of course, which is overshadowed by the seating of women delegates. And Garrison takes this dramatic gesture of refusing to take his seat on the platform floor, on the floor of the convention, and joins the women in the gallery and all of it. So, and this, the result of this is a series of very interesting editorials where he launches into British abolitionists, and he describes them as silver-slippered abolitionists. And for him, the crucial difference was that he felt they had never been really tested. So it was one thing to fight colonial slavery, which was distant. It was a very different thing to fight domestic slavery. And of course, Garrison, in a way, delighted in the role of a kind of martyr, who literally escaped threats on his life, and George Thompson, one of the lessons he brings back with him from the United States is that what he's witnessed in the United States is a new breed of reformer. And Harriet Martineau too comes back and writes this pamphlet called The New Martyr Age in America, where she sees people like Garrison as, again, a new kind of reformer. These are people who are willing to give up their lives for the cause. By contrast, Garrison thinks that British abolitionists are far too conservative, far too coy, far too safe. So he becomes much more interested in the Chartist movement. He sees them as the real reformers in Britain, whereas he thinks that the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society are really just a bunch of fairly stuffy, conservative, unimaginative people that he describes, as I said, as silver-slippered abolitionists. It's all too easy for them. They meet, they talk about things, and produce another pamphlet, but they don't embrace reform more generally, which he wants them to do. And Garrison, of course, was notorious for expanding. For him, it wasn't just about abolition; it was about a total reform of American society. It was, he embraced women's rights, he embraced pacifism, and all. It became for him a huge agenda, the kind of reform of American society. And that for him was the test of what a real reformer was. And Thompson went along with that. Thompson too, I think, saw himself as somebody who was genuinely a reformer, whereas the people he knew in the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society weren't. They were too cautious. So there is a critique, Laura. Yeah, definitely.
Great, brilliant. Thank you. I mean, I could ask endless questions as I like to do, but I'm aware that we're coming up to sort of 7 o'clock, and I know that you're in Toronto, and so I'm just going to check. Has anyone got any last questions for John? But they've been really interesting questions and really elaborated on some of the real meat of the book. So I'll be getting a copy, and then I'll be questioning you. I'll be questioning you over email. So that might keep you in Toronto.
I should add, if people are more interested in politics, there is a chapter on politics in this book. I didn't talk about that much, but if that's your thing and you want to talk about, the way in which British and American abolitionists approached the question of politics, and particularly the vote. And there's lots of stuff there that would interest you. Again, some of it interesting continuities, but very crucial differences between the way in which abolitionists in America, or political abolitionists in America, saw the future.
Well, thanks a lot, John. I think we will. Thank you. I like to do an actual clap. I hope you can hear it resounding, not like the first shots of the Civil War, but around and reaches you. But thanks so much for giving us such a brilliant talk about your book. Great answers for the questions, and being our first book club author. Really thanks for joining us. And if anyone does want to get in contact with John, I'm sure he'd be happy to answer any other questions.
I was just going to say the same thing. If you were too coy to answer a question, or you think of something later, I mean, by all means, get in touch with me. I'd be happy to try and reply.
Brilliant. Well, so thanks to our audience as well for attending this evening. I hope you'll continue to come to our online and now in-person events as well. So if you are in Liverpool or the different venues that we put on in-person events, hopefully we're moving back towards a state we were in a couple of years ago, but with this kind of broader sense of including people nationally and internationally in the different work that we're doing. So I'm going to just quickly advertise our next book talk. So it's going to be, again, co-hosted with Liverpool University Press, and that will be on May the 10th in 2022 by Jessica Moody, and her book will be The Persistence of Memory, Remembering Slavery in Liverpool, Slaving Capital of the World. And just before that, we're going to have a talk on 15th of March 2022 with Michael Bennett. We hope that will be in person as well. About research on merchant capital and the origins of Barbados sugar boom, 1627 to 1671. So all the details will be available on our website. And so I guess all that remains is to say have a lovely afternoon or evening wherever you are. Thanks for joining.
Okay, thank you.